There are moments in history when a single act tears through the silence of submission, when one man stands and says, "Enough." In the heart of the Sahel, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did just that. He did not carry the language of bankers, nor the smile of diplomats. He carried the fire of a people tired of foreign hands counting their future. For decades, the CFA Franc chained the economies of West Africa to a system that spoke in whispers from Paris. But now, there is a new wind, a new song, and its name echoes across continents: BRICS currency. This is not just about money. It's about dignity. It's about reclaiming the power to decide who we trade with, how we dream, and where our children stand tomorrow. If you believe Africa deserves its own destiny, its own voice, its own coin of freedom, then hit subscribe, family. Because this story is ours to tell. When Traoré shut down the CFA's power, the world gasped, and the Sahel took its first breath of freedom. It began, as revolutions often do, in silence. No fireworks, no parades, only a firm voice. And a decision that would echo through every market, every farm, every heart that had waited too long to be free. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré announced that Burkina Faso would move to end the era of dependency, the world barely understood what was coming. But the people of Ouagadougou, they felt it in their bones. Because this wasn't just another policy. It was a break of chains. For over 70 years, the CFA Franc had been the golden leash of French colonial legacy. Born in 1945, after the Second World War, it tied 14 African nations to a single treasury in Paris. Their money was printed in Europe, their reserves were stored abroad, their economies, once rich in gold, cotton, and promise, were managed from thousands of miles away. Every loaf of bread, every liter of fuel, every child's education. They all bore the invisible cost of a coin that did not belong to its people. To the outside world, the CFA was stability. To Africans, it was a constant reminder. Freedom had never been fully granted. But in 2020, a soldier, young, defiant, eyes unyielding, stood before the nation and said, "Burkina Faso will no longer kneel before foreign control. The age of the CFA is over." Those words struck like thunder. In the dusty markets of Bobo Dioulasso, traders stopped counting notes. On the airwaves, elders wept, remembering Sankara, the hero who once dreamed of an Africa that could feed and fund itself. And in the cafes of Paris, the unease was palpable, because for the first time in generations, the system trembled. Traoré's announcement wasn't a simple act of defiance. It was an economic declaration of independence. He began coordinating with Mali and Niger, two neighbors who shared his vision of unity and liberation from the colonial grip. The three nations formed what the world would soon call the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, a new bloc with one mission: sovereignty. While critics called it reckless, others saw in Traoré the rebirth of a continent's courage. He wasn't armed with missiles or sanctions. He was armed with something far more powerful: belief. And that belief spread like wildfire. From Dakar to Bamako, from Niamey to Accra, young Africans began to whisper his name with reverence. Traoré is not just a man, he's a movement. Still, this was not a simple victory. Ending CFA meant untying from a financial system that fed generations of dependency. It meant building a new one, from scratch: a national treasury, a stable reserve, a new currency, perhaps tied to Africa's own gold, or, some whispered, to the rising BRICS currency that promised trade beyond Western rules. Every step forward meant risk. Paris threatened sanctions. Western institutions warned of collapse, but the Sahel's young leader only smiled. They said we would fall, Traore told his people. But they forget. We've been standing for centuries. And for the first time, even those who once doubted him began to wonder. Could this be the dawn of something greater? Could this be the moment Africa finally took control of its economic soul? Because as the CFA's shadow began to fade, a new light emerged. Faint, fragile, but bright enough to stir hope in the hearts of millions. But as one empire's grip loosened, another force began to watch. BRICS, a new power rising in the east, waiting for Sahel to knock on its door. The news broke like thunder over the Sahara. One headline, Traore moves to end CFA Franc in the Sahel, flashed across every Western network. In Paris, boardrooms went silent. In Washington, analysts rushed to their maps, because suddenly, a young captain from Burkina Faso had set fire to 70 years of order. The French Treasury called it economic vandalism. The IMF called it a reckless move that could destabilize West Africa. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, it was called something else entirely: freedom. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré spoke to his people after the decision, he didn't stand behind glass podiums or speak from gilded halls. He stood before a sea of citizens, men, women, children, and said, "They say we are poor, but the poorest man is not the one without gold. It's the one without dignity. And we will never be poor again." The crowd erupted. Flags waved high. Women ululated. Old men wept openly. Because for once, a leader was not begging for aid. He was demanding respect. But not everyone was celebrating. France withdrew its remaining military advisors. ECOWAS leaders, under quiet pressure from the West, issued warnings of regional isolation, and sanctions, the familiar language of control, began to whisper through the financial markets. Yet, Traoré did not flinch. He turned to the alliance of Sahel states, Mali and Niger. And together they declared, "If we fall together. But if we rise as one." That was the moment the Sahel stopped being a frontier and became a front line. Meanwhile, far beyond the deserts and savannas, a different audience was watching. In Moscow, strategists nodded in approval. In Beijing, economists traced new lines on global trade maps. And in Johannesburg, voices inside the BRICS alliance began to whisper, "Africa is finally awakening, and the Sahel could be the door." For decades, BRICS had sought a new partner in Africa, a partner bold enough to reject Western dictates, but wise enough to build something lasting. And now, with the rise of Traoré, they saw a new possibility, a Sahel bloc that could trade in BRICS currency, independent of the dollar, independent of the euro. When BRICS leaders met quietly to discuss potential expansion, the idea of inviting the alliance of Sahel states was no longer fiction. The reasoning was clear. The Sahel holds vast gold reserves, perfect for backing a non-Western currency. It controls key trade corridors across the continent. And most importantly, it now has leadership with fire in its soul. Still, hope and danger always walk hand in hand. The West warned that aligning with BRICS would compromise democracy. But Traoré knew that democracy without sovereignty was just decorated dependency. He reminded his people of a truth older than empire. They tell us we are too small to choose, but a lion need not be big. It only needs to remember that it is a lion. In homes across Africa, elders nodded in pride. In schools, young boys and girls wrote his name on the walls. Traoré. To them, he wasn't just a president. He was a symbol. The proof that courage still had a place in politics. But every act of defiance carries a price. And as the CFA's influence crumbled, Western companies began to pull out. Inflation whispered through the markets. And the question on every lip was the same. Can the Sahel survive the storm it has summoned? For now, the captain stood tall, calm, amid the tempest. He spoke softly to his people. We have crossed the river. There is no turning back. And somewhere, in the quiet corridors of global power, BRICS economists began to smile. Because as Paris panicked and Washington warned, a new map was being drawn, one where Africa would no longer ask for permission to exist. But could the Sahel truly survive on its own? Or would the storm of sanctions, scarcity, and suspicion break the dream before it bloomed? Freedom is never free. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré cut the cord that bound the Sahel to the CFA Franc, the sound was not just a political echo, it was an earthquake. And when the dust settled, the real battle began. At first there was confusion. Shops closed early. Prices trembled like the leaves before a storm. Imported goods rose overnight. Some called it economic chaos, but others, the farmers, the miners, the traders, called it rebirth pains. They said, "A child must cry before it breathes." Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had walked into a new world without the safety net of the West. The World Bank halted loans. The EU suspended aid. Western media spoke in pitying tones. A failed state in the making. But in the villages of the Sahel, the tone was different. An old woman in Koudougou said, "We used to eat from their hand. Now we plant with our own." Yes, life became harder. Yes, the markets were uncertain. But for the first time in decades, the people felt something that no price tag could measure: ownership. In the capital, Traoré gathered his ministers. He spoke with the calm of a man who knew storms must come before harvest. "We will not starve," he said. "Our soil is rich. Our hands are many. And our pride is unshakable." He ordered a national program for local grain production and gold reserve accumulation, redirecting the wealth once sent abroad to strengthen internal trade. Miners who once sold to foreign intermediaries now sold directly to the state. And slowly, painfully, the Sahel began to breathe again. In Mali, local banks started printing new notes marked Sahelian credit, a symbol of unity. In Niger, youth groups built community co-ops to keep trade alive despite sanctions. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Internationally, reactions split the globe in two. In Europe, the move was labeled economic suicide. But in Africa, from Ghana to the Congo, people saw something sacred: a return to dignity. Nigerian commentators said, "If the Sahel can do it, why can't we?" South African media asked, "Is BRICS watching this?" And indeed, BRICS was watching very closely. Meetings between Sahel representatives and Russian, Indian, and Chinese envoys began quietly. Discussions about joining trade agreements outside the Western banking system took shape. Some insiders whispered that the BRICS currency could soon find a foothold in Africa through the Sahel, a symbolic gesture that the world's financial order was shifting. But even as hope rose, hardship deepened. The sanctions bit hard. Fuel was scarce. Families learned to stretch what little they had. And yet, through it all, a phrase echoed in the streets: "Better to suffer free than to feast in chains." Traoré became both a symbol and a target. Western media painted him as a populist soldier, but across Africa, murals of his face began appearing, painted next to Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba. The message was clear. The fire of independence had not gone out. It had simply found a new carrier. Every movement brings doubt. Every revolution demands sacrifice. But what the Sahel had gained was more than money. It was memory, a memory of standing tall. And in every sermon, every radio show, every whispered prayer under the desert stars, people began to say, "The captain has started something. Will the next generation finish it?" Because the question was no longer whether the CFA Franc would fall. It had already begun to crumble. The question now was, what would rise to take its place? Would it be the BRICS currency, carrying Africa into a new financial dawn? Or would it be a homegrown Sahel coin, a symbol purely of African soil and spirit? And as the world watched the Sahel struggle and stand, the great powers began to move their pieces. The West warned of collapse. The East whispered of partnership. The game was changing, and the stakes were higher than ever. Across the Atlantic, in glass towers and think tanks, maps of Africa glowed under digital light. Washington analysts leaned forward, brows furrowed. Paris grew restless. Because what Captain Ibrahim Traoré had done was not just symbolic, it was contagious. For the West, the Sahel was never about gold or grain alone. It was about influence, the quiet power of money that decides who eats and who waits. The CFA Franc had been a silent tool of control for generations. But now, that lever was slipping away. In the corridors of the U.S. State Department, voices whispered, "If the Sahel aligns with BRICS, we lose the center of West Africa." For decades, America had viewed Africa through the lens of aid and stability. But suddenly, the narrative was shifting, from charity to sovereignty. The language of diplomacy had to change, because the old script no longer worked. Meanwhile, in Paris, the reaction was personal. French politicians spoke of betrayal. Media headlines mourned the loss of influence in its former colonies. But to Africans, it was not betrayal. It was justice delayed. In contrast, BRICS nations saw opportunity wrapped in history. In Moscow, strategists compared Traoré to the anti-colonial heroes of old. In Beijing, economists quietly explored pathways to link African resources to BRICS currency mechanisms, bypassing the dollar, bypassing Europe. In Delhi and Brasilia, ministers spoke of a multipolar Africa, where no single power dictates the terms. To them, Sahel was more than desert. It was a proving ground for the post-Western world. They understood that whoever wins Sahel wins more than resources. They win the narrative. Because if a young captain in uniform can inspire nations to break free, what message does that send to the rest of the global South? It says, you can rise, you can trade on your own terms, you can stand without asking permission, but every new dawn has its shadows. BRICS, too, carries ambitions. Russia seeks influence. China seeks access. And though their language is partnership, the Sahel must tread carefully, for no empire calls itself an empire. Still, Traoré's message is clear. We will walk with those who respect us, not those who rule us. It is a quiet defiance, spoken not with anger, but with certainty. A statement that Africa no longer waits to be saved. As Washington issues warnings and Paris laments, BRICS extends an open hand, and somewhere between those two worlds the Sahel stands, proud, unbending, and watched by billions. Yet the question lingers. Can Traoré keep his nation sovereign between giants, or will the dance of empires pull the Sahel back into someone's shadow? The desert wind carries whispers these days. Whispers of a new order, a new alliance, a new coin that could rewrite Africa's destiny. And standing at the edge of it all is one man, one soldier, one dreamer, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He has broken the chains. But what now? Freedom is not the end. It is the beginning of the test. If the Sahel truly wishes to join BRICS, it must do more than rebel, it must rebuild. 1. What the Sahel needs to enter BRICS. BRICS does not invite nations for their courage alone. It demands readiness. To walk into that hall, Sahel must bring not emotion, but structure, a sovereign central bank, independent from French and Western systems. The heart of Sahel's money must beat within its own soil, a stable reserve built on gold, agriculture, and resource wealth, not promises printed overseas. Transparent governance, for BRICS partners seek trust as much as trade. Regional security, because no economy can grow where guns speak louder than harvests. Traore understands this. His speeches echo it. We cannot enter a new world carrying the debts of the old. To join the strong, we must first stand strong ourselves. 2. The promise of BRICS. If accepted, the Sahel could gain more than allies. It could gain a new foundation. Access to the BRICS Development Bank, funding without the humiliation of Western conditions. Trade in BRICS currency, liberating Sahel from the grip of the dollar and the euro. Technology partnerships in agriculture, mining, and renewable energy. A voice in shaping the global South, where Africa is not the listener but the speaker. For a region long treated as a frontier, BRICS could mean something sacred, equal footing. A seat at the table, where Africa's destiny is not discussed, but decided. 3. The risks and shadows. But Traore knows. No alliance is pure light. Every promise carries a price. BRICS, like the West before it, has giants with their own appetites. China will want minerals, Russia will want strategy, India will want influence. If Sahel enters unprepared, it may swap one master for another. A new chain in a different color. We must trade as lions, not as lambs, Traore said. Partnership without respect is just another form of slavery. That line, fierce, simple, sacred, has become a mantra among the youth of Burkina Faso. Because they understand, the battle for independence does not end when the flag is raised. It ends when your soul is no longer for sale. 4. The vision beyond BRICS. Whether Sahel joins BRICS or walks alone, the road ahead will test its faith, its unity, and its will. The dream is not merely to switch systems, but to create a new one. A world where Africa trades in its own wealth, speaks in its own currency, and stands on its own truth. And if the BRICS alliance becomes a bridge to that freedom, then Traore will have done more than lead a nation. He will have sparked a continent's rebirth. One day, he told a gathering of students, Africa will not need to knock on any door, because Africa will have its own house. The crowd rose, hands lifted high, not in worship, but in hope. But history is watching. The question is no longer whether the Sahel can rise. It is whether the world will let it stay standing. There comes a time when a people must decide, not what they are worth in gold, but what they are worth in pride. And today, that moment has arrived in the Sahel. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not just challenge a currency. He challenged a mindset, the quiet voice that said, Africa cannot stand alone. He silenced that voice with action. He tore down a system built on obedience and built a dream founded on dignity. Now, as the winds of change sweep across the desert, the question remains, will the Sahel walk into BRICS? Will Africa trade with the world not as a servant, but as a partner? Will BRICS currency become the coin of a new freedom, or just another mirror of the old chains? But beyond politics and power, this story speaks to something deeper. The soul of a people rediscovering their voice. It's about mothers who no longer fear tomorrow, About young men who believe again in building, not fleeing. It's about a continent learning that wealth does not come from permission. It comes from purpose. The road will be long. The enemies will be loud. But as Traore once said, when you walk in truth, even your shadow stands tall. So let the world watch. Let the critics whisper, because history belongs not to the cautious, but to the courageous. If you believe Africa deserves its own destiny, share this message. If you believe freedom is worth the price, leave a comment below and raise your voice. And if you believe the dream of BRICS currency can become the dawn of true independence, then don't just watch. Stand with it. Because the world may forget names, but it never forgets moments. And this moment, when the Sahel rose under one captain's fire, will echo across generations. Africa will not kneel again, he said, and the desert answered, Amen.